Good day, family. This is yours truly, Aikens Doherty, Mr. Make and Pay. Just wanted to talk to you guys about the Rayshard Brooks death. I know it's been a minute, but I just wanted to give my thoughts out there. I'm not going to bore you guys too much with the story because a lot of you guys have seen the video and you already know what's going on. Just to make a long story short, Mr. Rayshard Brooks was asleep in his car in a Wendy's drive-thru. It appears a Wendy's employee called the officer to come check on him. The officer came, woke him up. Mr. Rayshard Brooks moved his car. The officer called a DUI officer. The officer comes, talks to Mr. Rayshard Brooks, and they pat him down. He had no weapons, which is very, very important because at that time the officers knew that he was not in possession of a deadly weapon. The encounter was about 41 minutes or so. It was pretty much respectful. Mr. Rayshard Brooks was very respectful to the officer. Most times he was using sir, Mr. The officers were also respectful, except for one of the DUI officer appeared to be toying with Mr. Brooks. He was going back and forth, asking him questions. What did you drink? And at some point in time, Mr. Brooks was like, I had something to drink, some alcohol. Somebody bought me alcohol. Then the officer asked Mr. Brooks, what kind of alcohol? Mr. Brooks said it was top shelf alcohol. Then the officer asked him, what kind of top shelf alcohol? And I'm like, does it really matter whether Mr. Brooks got drunk of top shelf or bottom shelf alcohol? The last time I checked, you would get drunk either way, whether it's top shelf or bottom shelf. But nevertheless, the encounter was pretty much cordial for about 41 minutes. And there was a point in time in the video, I believe, where Mr. Brooks said that he had some money in his pocket and the officer was trying to find out how much he had in his pocket or so. I guess, some of these officers sometimes want to dig more than is necessary, instead of them to face the facts at hand. But they're always looking for stuff. But anyway, the officer eventually determines that Mr. Brooks was not safe to drive or whatever, and he decides to arrest Mr. Brooks. The officer did not tell Mr. Brooks he was under arrest. I believe he just told him, went behind him and tried to handcuff Mr. Brooks. As he was about to handcuff Mr. Brooks resisted, and a tussle started. Mr. Brooks was able to grab one of the tasers from one of the officers. I guess the officer was trying to fire the taser. He grabbed the taser, was able to free himself, and he started fleeing. The officer who had his taser started pursuing Mr. Brooks. At some point in time in the video, Mr. Brooks was running and he turned around. I don't believe he turned around completely, but he used his hand to fire the taser at the officer. And the officer shot him, I think, 3 shots, 2 of which may have struck Mr. Brooks. From the video I saw, it appears the officer already had his hand on his pistol even before Mr. Brooks reached for his tasered the officer. So it appears the officer was trying to shoot Mr. Brooks anyway. From the Fulton County District Attorney's account, it appears from the time the officer fired his weapon and at the point where Mr. Brooks was about 18 feet or so. It was a good distance. And when Mr. Brooks was running, excuse me on that one, it's my allergies kicking in. So it's important that it was about 18 feet when the officer fired his weapon. It was also important that this happened in the Wendy's parking lot. There were other cars. So the question right now is whether the shooting was justified. In my opinion, I will say no. And the reason is that I think first of all, I think it's an ego kill before I get into the legality. I think the officer is probably thinking, wow, Mr. Brooks just pulled a James Bond on us. It's not appealing to the ear. It's embarrassing. How would I tell my fellow officers or my colleagues that a drunk person was able to tussle and outmaneuver two officers, grab their taser, and flee? I mean, those are things that happen in James Bond movies, and the officer was not going to allow that to happen under his watch, which from the Fulton County DA's account, after the officer shot Mr. Brooks, he got to Mr. Brooks, kicked him, and said, "I got him." I mean, that is probably in reference to saying that, hey, I got this guy who was just about to pull a James Bond on us. I didn't let this happen under my watch. So it appears to be an ego kill. Also, let's look at the legality in Georgia. Deadly force is allowed if it is necessary to protect the person and other people from death or serious bodily injury. The operative word is necessary. Death and bodily injury. A lot of people are not talking about this. They just say, oh, the officer was fearful for his life. That is not even, and the thing about it is that if a jury were to get this case, it will be what would a reasonable, prudent officer in the position of that officer do under those circumstances. Not whether another officer just says, I'm scared for my life. Because if that were the case, anyone can just say, I'm scared for my life. That doesn't mean you walk away free. It's what a reasonable, prudent officer will do under those circumstances. Will a reasonable, prudent officer felt it was necessary to kill Mr. Brooks, to use deadly force on Mr. Brooks, to prevent death upon himself or serious bodily injury upon the officer or to other people? And I think the answer is no. If you think about it, because when Mr. Brooks fired the taser from the Fulton County DA's account, that taser had already been fired twice, which means it was no longer potent. And that officer, being a trained person, should know that. A police officer is not a lay person. They are trained to deal with arrests, resisting arrest all the time. So this is not something that should be foreign to a police officer. This is something that should be handled in training, and they should be used to it. And I don't believe it was a reasonable, prudent officer under the circumstances would have felt it was necessary to use deadly force to prevent death upon him. Because obviously, Mr. Brooks was running away. He only had a taser. The officer was not going to die or serious bodily injury. Mr. Brooks was 18 feet away from the officer when he fired the weapon. He was running away. He didn't want to go to jail that night. You can tell Mr. Brooks was trying every way to talk himself out of going to jail that night. It appears he may have been on probation. Maybe he was not trying to go back to jail. His daughter appears to have a birthday, or was about to have a birthday, or just had a birthday. He wanted to go back to his daughter, or he was mentioning something about going to a hotel. So he probably had unfinished business to do in the hotel. Who knows? So you can tell he was not trying to go to jail that night. And Mr. Brooks also tried to convince the officer to let him call somebody to come pick him up, to walk home, do everything but not go to jail. But the officer was like, no. The officer did not let him do that. And again, in this society, a lot of people get the deference, or officers give deference to the wishes of people a lot under the circumstances. Sometimes if they're of a different color, where they're allowed to call an Uber or have a family member or a friend come pick them up. But Mr. Brooks did not get that deference. There are other stories of other people who have engaged in gunfire with police officers and somehow managed to be captured alive. There was a case in Spalding County where a guy, I believe, exchanged gunfire with police and he was captured alive. There was a guy in North Carolina, Dylan Roof, who went to a black church, sat with them, worshiped with them, and committed mass murder, killed the people in the church. and he was captured alive. And on top of that, they were bought him Burger King. Mr. Brooks was not even given the opportunity to go home, let alone get a Wendy's burger, which he was in a drive-through to get. So the officer did not give any deference to the wishes of Mr. Brooks, even though if there was any situation where the officer will have exercised his discretion or given deference to the wishes of Mr. Brooks to allow him to go home, this will have been the perfect scenario, because Mr. Brooks was like, Mr. Sir. He was so respectful and polite. The officer could have just, if he wanted to put an end to everything that night and just say, hey, you know what, call someone to come get you. You're being too respectful. You've been a good person tonight. He was not having it. So the question now is, was it necessary for the officer to fire that weapon to prevent death upon that officer and to other people? And I don't believe so. Even based on Georgia law, a taser is not a deadly weapon, especially if that taser is no longer potent and the officer knew or should have known that. So I don't believe that the officer should have fired his weapon. I don't think it was necessary for the officer to shoot those shots, especially given it was a parking lot. They had other people in the parking lot. There were probably kids in those cars, people trying to get a burger. It was at night, just trying to get something to eat and go home. So to fire 3 shots, and I believe one of the shots hit another car, that guy in the car could have been killed by a stray bullet. So sometimes officers need to know when to fire their weapons, not just, hey, someone is running, pow, 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 pow. So no. So, just to wrap up my conversation, and I thought about this, would the outcome have been different had Mr. Brooks been a person of another race? Would Mr. Brooks be alive today if he were white? And I thought about that question over and over and over. And sadly, I believe the answer is yes. And that is extreme foolishness.